Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fifth session on Hezekiah and the deadly virus. And in this session, we're going to consider the concept of the second wave. So just a quick little recap on what we've been looking at. We talked about how that in the story of Hezekiah, the key word is this concept of trust. Hezekiah, of course, is set out as a king unique in Judah's history, in that it says in the record of 2 Kings and chapter 18 that he trusted in the Lord like no other king before or after him. So when you think about Hezekiah, you think about this concept of trust. And we saw in looking at the theme of trust, the building blocks of trust. And I know I've spoken on this quite a bit in a number of places, particularly in our meeting in Pakuranga. Essentially, there are three building blocks of trust, and I had an acronym for them that people could remember. The acronym was ELA, E-L-A, and the building blocks are empathy, logic, and authenticity, which is where we get this acronym of ELA. What we looked at last session last week was Hezekiah and his incredible compassion and empathy that he had with the people. So he made connection to the people, and he did so in the most loving way. He appealed to the fact that they were in this situation because they neglected God, and he reached out even to the very outcasts of Israel. And if you remember, we looked at the fact that he sent this really passionate appeal to the northern kingdom as far as Manasseh and Zebulun. And the appeal was based on Hosea's message that if they returned to God, God would return to them and that he would heal them. And this was the whole concept of the fact that from God's eyes, they were diseased. They were leprous. And he made this impassioned appeal to them, and many came down and listened to Hezekiah, and he invited them to this Passover, and it was an incredible time of Reformation, and it was very much built on the spirit of grace and love. And it was quite a contrast, if you remember, we talked about, to Josiah's Passover. So Josiah's Passover, the phrase which comes up over and again, is that he did according to all that was written in the word of the Lord, because they found, of course, the book of the law in Josiah's day. And Josiah did according to the letter of the law. And in Josiah's Passover, it says, even though he did these things, the heart of the people wasn't changed. Whereas Hezekiah, it says specifically that Hezekiah prayed to God on behalf of the people, and it says, and God heard from heaven, his dwelling place, and he healed the people, which is exactly what Hosea said that God would do. So you had a beautiful picture of Hezekiah bringing about this wonderful change in a nation that was so corrupt from the days of Ahaz. And the record in Micah, which talks about the impending invasion of the Assyrian, talks about one who would stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and would deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into the land and treads within our borders. Now, Micah chapter 5 is a beautiful picture, really, of the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the end picture. And the Assyrian, of course, is a picture of the northern invaders of Israel, and ultimately Jesus will defeat that invader. But in the first instance, Micah is pointing to the story of Hezekiah, that when the Assyrian would come into the land, you would have this picture of this wonderful character who would be the protector of the flock. And this was really Hezekiah. And what we learn when you look at the story of Hezekiah's Reformation is, and I think if Ray Allinson's online, he'll appreciate this next slide, is Hezekiah's Reformation was based on love, not fear. It was based on grace, not law. In fact, the reference in Hezekiah says, even though they did things not according to what was written exactly in the law, he used certain clauses because they kept the Passover the second month, and many of the priests hadn't purified themselves according to the law, and yet Hezekiah prayed on their behalf. So it was all based on love. And what we learn from Hezekiah is there's two ways to shepherd. And Hezekiah was a shepherd that was not like this. So this is one way to shepherd sheep, and it's common in New Zealand. And this is a shepherding by using fences. And the problem by using fences is when you shepherd in this manner is that the sheep tend to push the boundaries. They're always going to the edge of the fence. That's the principle of shepherding by law. That's what the law was all about. It set up a set of fences in which to keep us in. And when you have a boundary or a law, human nature is always to push the boundary, to go to the absolute extremities. How far can I go without stepping over the boundary? And that's really what life under the law was about. It's like, so long as I don't go that far, I'm still within the law, I'm still safe, I'm okay. But the other way of shepherding is what is very common in the Middle East. It's shepherding by the water source, the well. And this is a picture of wells and fences. And this is a very common thing in the Middle East, that because the shepherd had to cover vast amount of area in order to feed the flock, you couldn't fence them in like you do in New Zealand, where we have so much green grass, you can just move them from paddock to paddock. In order for a shepherd to find food for a flock, he would cover great distances. And in doing so, the sheep had to learn to trust the shepherd. They had to hear his voice. The shepherd knew the sheep by name. And so he would call them and they would follow them. And he would lead them to green pastures, and he would lead them to the life source of water, which was the source of life for the flock. And this picture of wells and fences shows that when we think about our life in Christ, he is the wellspring of life. And the shepherd or the flock will stay near the wellspring of life. They go where their food sources and where their life sources. So they don't stray. They don't go as far away as they can without going over the boundary. They stay close as they can to the shepherd. That's dynamic shepherding. That's following. And I think that's the principle of life in Christ, is Christ showed us this concept of the fact you've seen in the law that it says, thou shalt not kill. I say to you, he that's angry with his brother has already committed murder. And so Jesus just basically blew the whole concept of law and legalism out of the water. And he taught this incredible concept that if you love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and mind, if your focus is on loving the character of God and of Christ, then there is no need for law. You don't have to be told you shall not kill, because that would be the last thing on your mind. You don't have to be told you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, because you love righteousness, you love God. And Hezekiah's Reformation was all on this principle. So what we're going to look at now as we come to this concept of the second wave is the second part of the building block of trust, and that is this concept of logic. We trust things because they make sense, because we understand them. When like our doctrines, for instance, we are confident in what we would call the truth because there's a logic aspect to what we believe. And we know that when you think about this concept of particularly what happens or responsibility to judgment after death, our beliefs make sense that only those that are responsible are raised. God doesn't raise everybody because they're not responsible to judgment. And then you've got this process, of course, that of the resurrection and the judgment and the reward given according to a person's actions. When we look at doctrines of modern Christianity today, there's a certain amount of illogical, nonsensical teaching within those doctrines. And I just wonder how people really trust those. I mean, how do you have a judgment, a resurrection and a judgment? God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world. If when people die, they're already judged. So they die and immediately they either go to heaven or hell. What's the point of the resurrection and judgment if they've already been rewarded? That doesn't really make sense. What's worse with that is that, you know, this whole concept of burning in a lake of fire forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, that doesn't reconcile with a God of love, and it doesn't reconcile with justice. Why would God inflict torture upon people for eternity for 70 years of life now where they're already prone to sin? So we trust things because of logic. Well, things have to make sense. We can put things together and understand them. Now, here's the story in Hezekiah's life where he really established trust based on his understanding of God's character, the way he worked in the past, and he communicated that to the people and helped them to trust in him. Here's the key quote. So if you've got your Bibles, have a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 32. And you'll see I've got Young's literal translation there, and this is again showing the empathy of Hezekiah. It says, Hezekiah, speaking to their heart, said. So you get to this climax now in Hezekiah's story where the Assyrian is about to invade into Judah. And Hezekiah encourages the people, and it says he spoke to their heart. And this is what he says. 2 Chronicles 32 verse 7. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and the horde that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and fight our battles. Now, something really interesting in what Hezekiah says. This is not just a random statement that Hezekiah makes to the people. He has chosen these words very carefully. So in your bubbles, you can either put this in the chat box, or you can turn on your mic and make a comment here. Where are these words coming from? Where is Hezekiah basing this verse from? Where have you heard this before? What's the echo?
Joshua.
Excellent. So David's got the first one. Joshua versus Jericho. And the words are exactly what is used 3 times in Joshua 1, where Joshua says to the people, be strong and courageous. Exactly the same Hebrew phrase used 3 times. Anybody got any advances on Joshua? Let me check this bubble. Elisha to the younger servant. Excellent. That is the other one, but that's the third one. So there's one more. Anybody got? I've got these out of order. I should have put them the other way around, but that's correct. Elisha to the younger servant. Anybody know the other one?
Possibly David.
Possibly David. It's a tricky one. Here they are. I'll give them to you. So Jehoshaphat versus Ammon, Moab, and Seir says, do not be afraid nor dismayed. That's the second part of the verse, and that is the exact Hebrew phrase that Hezekiah uses. So you say, be strong and courageous, he quotes Joshua. Be not afraid nor dismayed, he quotes Jehoshaphat. And then as Elaine says, they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And that is exactly what Elisha says to Gehazi when versing the Syrian. So versing Syria. So the armies of Syria came down Ben-Hadad and they compassed about them. And of course, that's the story where, you know, Gehazi can't see the angelic host. And Elisha says, don't be afraid, because they that be with us are more than they that be with them. So 3 things here that Hezekiah quotes. Now, here's the challenge for you. What have they got in common? What have these 3 events got in common? And for those that were at our prophecy talk last night, you should be able to pick up what they've got in common. Any ideas there?
Is it to do with the with being strong and courageous against a common enemy? And you know, to my mind comes the principle of sin, where we need to be strong and courageous against it, and we see that in particularly Joshua versus Jericho, Jehoshaphat versus Ammon, Elisha versus Syria. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yep, definitely in that concept of being strong against sin. Well, here's something common with all of those 3 things, and that is, in every one of those incidents, there was no human hand lifted to defeat the enemy. It was God's hand and God's deliverance. So when Jericho's walls came down, all they did was walk around the walls. They didn't fight against them, and they brought down a whole city miraculously because God delivered them. And the same with the story of Joshua versus Ammon. God went forward to fight on their behalf. Elisha versus Syria, God smote them with blindness. So when faced with this huge army and huge opposition, they stand still and they see the salvation of God. And this is what Hezekiah is communicating to the people, and this is what he's trying to show through an intellectual process. He's quoted directly 3 events, and of course it was going to be that it says in Isaiah chapter 31 verse 8, when the Assyrian was going to fall, it was going to fall by a sword not of man, and a sword not of man shall devour him. Because we know the story how it's going to end. An angel went forth in one night, and 185,000 Assyrians woke up dead, as the record says, and they got up and they were all dead people in the morning. So God delivered them. And Hezekiah, you see, what's interesting is I think this is really powerful for us, is understanding the way God has worked in the past, understanding and seeing what God has done in your life in the past gives you confidence to know that he can do it again. And I guess in my own life, I've had this on two occasions, particularly when, I went through an experience in Pakistan, and when I went through the collapse of our business. On both occasions, God delivered through intense prayer when I became completely helpless. And I know that the second time I was confident God could do it again because he had done it in the past. And I think we need to build on past experiences to have confidence in what God can do. Now, what's interesting here, it says, and the people, the next part of the verse in Chronicles chapter 32, it says they rested themselves on the words of Hezekiah. And that's the idea of trusting. They leaned on the words of Hezekiah. So you can see Hezekiah, it's just beautiful, isn't it? He spoke into their hearts. That's what the Young's literal translation says. And he built this incredible picture of logic that if we trust in God, because, here they were and they saw the might and power of Assyria coming, and they must have thought, Hezekiah is starting to strengthen the walls and they're doing all this thing, and they must have thought, what are we doing? This is hopeless. Have you seen the might and power of Assyria? And so Hezekiah just lays it out for them and says, they're nothing, absolutely nothing. So there's something interesting in this picture that I've got there in terms of showing trust, and I've chosen horses for a really good reason, because this is what you might call a bit of a paradox. And this is where everything changes in the story of Hezekiah. And there's something really interesting that we want to go through now in regards to this second wave, the invasion of the Assyrian. So a paradox. There's a Hezekiah paradox. These two signs, these two things are a pretty good example of a paradox, isn't it? Primitive road, no warning signs, written on a sign. And then the other one, nothing's written in stone, and it's written in stone. So these are examples of a paradox, something that says something but has something almost exactly the opposite. There is a paradox in the story of Hezekiah, one which needs to be reconciled. Here's the paradox. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 7, it says of Hezekiah that his trust was like no other king before or after him. Such was his trust in God. And the Lord was with him because of his trust. Wherever he went out, he prospered. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. So you get this picture of Hezekiah, and if you just looked at those verses, you would say, wow, what a king. Trusted like no other king before or after. In the face of the king of Assyria, who came into the land, he says, I will not serve you. He rebelled against the king of Assyria. But how do you reconcile this? Same chapter, 7 verses later, Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish and says, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose upon me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And in that picture, you've got a picture of the kings that submitted to the powerful hand of the Assyrian juggernaut when they came into the land. How do you reconcile those two verses? One says Hezekiah refused to serve the king of Assyria. He rebelled against them and he didn't serve him. 7 verses later, you've got this picture of Hezekiah like vacillating in complete weakness. And that's what the Bible record says. The historical record in the Taylor Prism in the British Museum records the words of Sennacherib. And it says, as for Hezekiah, the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities I besieged, 200,000 people, small and great, male and female, I took captive, I carried them away. Hezekiah, I shut up like a caged bird in Jerusalem. And as for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him. The Arabs and mercenary troops, which he had brought in to strengthen Jerusalem and his royal city, deserted him. And in addition to 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver to pay tribute and to accept servitude, he dispatched by his messengers. So here you've got this picture, which is endorsed by the Taylor Prism, of Hezekiah completely capitulating and serving the king of Assyria. Yet the biblical record says Hezekiah was this mountain of trust. And everything we've seen about Hezekiah up to this point shows us he is a mountain of trust. So how are we going to reconcile this paradox? Well, coming back to the record of 2 Kings. Sorry, Neil, I just muted you. I just sort of heard somebody else on there. Please don't be offended. So in 2 Kings, in chapter 18, we find in verse 9, 4 years into Hezekiah's reign, it says, in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which is the 7th year of Hoshea son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came against Samaria and besieged it, and at the end of 3 years he took it, in the 6th year of Hezekiah. So he got a picture of the first 6 years of Hezekiah's reign. And in the 4th year, so we know what Hezekiah did in the first few years. He really encouraged and he strengthened the people. He knew that the Assyrian had already entered into the land of Judah, or particularly into the northern kingdom, because his father had become a vassal king paying tribute to the Assyrian. It was Ahaz who went up to Samaria and took gold out of the temple and paid all this money to Tiglath-Pileser. So the Assyrian was already making inroads into the land. 4 years into Hezekiah's reign, the northern kingdom is besieged. It took 3 years and then they took it. It's believed that Assyria came down into the land on multiple occasions. Their presence was already in and around Judah. And so Hezekiah, in the first 6 or 7 years of his life, was frantically getting prepared for these events. And then it says in 2 Kings 18, verse 13, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came against all the fortified cities of Judah and took it. Now, this is a climax of what had begun on the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign. So you've got a picture of 10 years between the 4th year and the 14th year of Assyria's presence in both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And historical records say that Sennacherib came in waves into the land. He didn't just come swoop down and just overthrow on one event. They had made incursions into Judah on several occasions. And what we're reading in 2 Kings 18 verse 13 is the climax. It's the it's the final, if you like. That's why we're calling it the second wave. This is the one where he comes down and completely overthrows it. And of course, we know about the Assyrian in terms of his power and his might. And we looked at this phrase, I will put hooks in his jaws and draw him back. That's directly quoted of the Assyrian, and it's linked to the story of the Gogan invasion in Ezekiel chapter 38, and it's built on the cruelty of the Assyrian who did exactly that. When they took people captive, they put hooks in their jaws and they dragged them away. And some of these pictures that are found were found on the Nineveh reliefs that are now in the British Museum, which has a whole detailed account of the cruelty of Assyria. It's pretty horrific, even looking at it on some of these stone reliefs, but it gives you an appreciation of just how powerful and how evil and how cruel the Assyrian was. So here you've got a picture on the reliefs of all these different kingdoms that are subjected or under the rule of the Assyrian, bowing before the Assyrian. On this picture, you've got their siege weapons and war weapons, and if you look closely at this, it gets pretty nasty as you see the cruelty of them hanging people up on spikes and dismembering people. Perhaps you don't need to see any more, but they were horrific and cruel. And the record says that the Assyrian, with all of this might and cruelty and power, came down in the 14th year. And we know when we look at this record that it happened to coincide with another event. It says of Hezekiah, he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. We also know that Hezekiah had 15 years added to his life. So when you know he reigned for 29 years, sorry, have I got that right? Yeah, so I have to go back one. So let me just go back a slide there. Yeah, so he reigned for 29 years. I'll just get my maths right for a moment. He reigned for 29 years. He had 15 years extended to his life because he got sick. So we know that it was the 14th year of his reign when Hezekiah was sick. And we know that he was very sick. In those days, Hezekiah became sick to the point of death. And we know that even though 2 Kings 20 is written after the events of the destruction of the Assyrian, it's an account which is recorded about events that coincided with the destruction of the Assyrian, because in 2 Kings 20 verse 6, God promises Hezekiah that he will add 15 years to his life and deliver the city out of the hand of Assyria and defeat and defend this city for mine own name's sake and my servant David's sake. So what you get from this is that right at that very time when the full onslaught of Assyria came down into the land, Hezekiah was totally, completely incapacitated. He was sick to the point of death. Now, what I'd like to suggest to you, and this is a little bit of a hypothesis, but we want to establish some corroborative evidence from the scripture around this, is that of the 14 years of Hezekiah's reign, 7 years were in good times, and he was building and encouraging and strengthening the people. I believe he got sick somewhere around his 7th year, and I think it's a little bit of the type of 7 good years and 7 bad years. And God tested the nation, and during the next 7 years or so of Hezekiah's life, after the Assyrian took away the northern kingdom and began to come down into Judah, Hezekiah became very sick, and his sickness got worse and worse and worse. So much so that he had to give over the keys of the kingdom. Now, this becomes a theme, and the key to this story, excuse that pun, is Isaiah chapter 22. You get this picture in Isaiah chapter 22, and we're going to come back to that. In fact, let's look at it now. Isaiah chapter 22, which is built upon the crisis moment of the Assyrian invasion. And in this record in Isaiah chapter 22, it says this little phrase, which is picked up in the New Testament, and it's connected by parallel passage to what Jesus says to Peter, but it's also picked up in the book of Revelation. So in Isaiah chapter 22 is the story of Eliakim, a servant of Hezekiah, being given authority and giving him the key to the house of David. It's in verse 22. A good one to remember, Isaiah 22:22. It says of Eliakim, verse 20, in that day I will call Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, I will clothe him with your robe, bind your sash on him, and I'll commit authority to his hand, and you will be a father to the, he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to the house of Judah, and I will place on his shoulder the keys to the house of David. Now, when Jesus said to Peter, he says, look, Peter, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom. The reason that story in Matthew chapter 16 of Jesus committing to Peter the keys to the kingdom is a picture of Jesus saying to Peter, I'm going away and I'm leaving you the responsibility. So giving somebody the keys to the kingdom is committing responsibility or an authority over the house. And Isaiah chapter 22 is a picture of the authority, the keys to the house of David, control of the kingdom being given to Eliakim, the servant of Hezekiah. The question is, in this chapter in Isaiah 22, who is the he that's being mentioned when it says in that day, verse 21, I will clothe him, Eliakim, with your robe? Who's Isaiah speaking to? I will bind your sash on him. Is this the keys transferring from Hezekiah to Eliakim? Well, the answer is no, it's not. Herein we are introduced to the traitor. In verse 15, thus saith the Lord God, go to the steward Shebna, who is over the household. So you have this guy Shebna, and it says he's over the household. And he's the one that has the robe, verse 21, and he has the keys to the kingdom, which are taken off him and given to Eliakim. You see that happening? I will clothe him with your robe, I will bound your sash on him, and I will commit your authority to his hand. So this is Isaiah saying to Shebna, I'm about to demote you. And what we learn from this is that Shebna, this character, whoever he is, has the robe, the sash, and the keys to the kingdom. So everything went pear-shaped in Judah when Hezekiah got sick, because somebody had to take over the rulership of the country. Hezekiah was so sick, I believe, that he was shut up and in lockdown, in contamination in his own house because he had leprosy. And we'll come and look at that a little bit closer in our next session. So Hezekiah is taken out of the picture. God tests the people. He takes their king that they trusted away from them. And now what are they going to do? And it turns out they commit the kingdom to this guy Shebna. And when you read through Isaiah chapter 22, you get a picture of how bad the nation had become in such a short space of time. And as they watched the Assyrian army come down, instead of being like Hezekiah, trusting in God, they went into panic mode. And they tried everything in which to help them, just like Ahaz, defend against this invading army. Here are the failed plans of a faithless man. This is what Shebna does. First of all, his idea was to pay off Sennacherib, which is where we get the idea of the gold being taken from out of the temple, even stripped off the gates or the posts of the temple doors, and sent to Sennacherib to pay him off. Problem is, Sennacherib is typical mafia. You know, he had imposed upon Judah a taxation which had come upon them from the days of Ahaz. And you get that picture, of course. I have done wrong, withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of the king of Judah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And that was the money paid. And so he paid all this money off. But you know what happens with the mafia and the bully? Is when you pay them money, they turn around and often say, I think we can extract a bit more from them. And what happens is, instead of Assyria saying, righto, I'm going to leave you alone now and go back to Assyria, he came back again. And there's a whole lot of stuff, by the way, in Isaiah about this agreement, which this broken contract which Assyria breaks. So that was his first plan. The second plan of a...
One moment. Is this?
The second plan, this is Siri somehow trying to get in on this conversation. The second plan was to buy horses and chariots from Egypt. And you get this a lot from this story in Isaiah. Around this time, it says, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, that rely on horses and who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, and they do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult to the Lord. So the second plan of Shebna was to go and buy, or to get some, you know, a good military installment. He went and bought the best horses and the best chariots, which were in Egypt, so that he could increase the military strength to try to defend against Sennacherib and his army. And Isaiah talks a lot about going down to Egypt. Now, the third plan was to make an alliance or a confederacy with the southern king, the king of the south, Ethiopia. It says, Isaiah 36 verse 9 says, now the king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, he is set out to fight against you. And when he heard this, he sent messengers to Hezekiah. So there was this thing that the southern kingdom heard about Assyria's plans, and there was an alliance or an agreement made between the Tirhakah, king of Cush or Ethiopia, and an alliance with Judah. And these are, by the way, pictures and statutes of the story of Tirhakah. So they were the three plans of Shebna that we learn when we look carefully at Isaiah. And you can see in this record in Isaiah chapter 22, what Isaiah says to Shebna. He says in verse 15, he says, who do you think you are? What is this? You're over the household. Go to Shebna and say to him, verse 16, what are you doing here? You've cut out a tomb for yourself and carved in the dwelling of the rock. So what Shebna had done, this is a picture of supposedly of Shebna making himself a special tomb in amongst the kings of Judah. We would call this lining his own coffin. How encouraging would have this been to the people of Israel? You know, here was this guy and he was like, oh, I'm over the house. Let me make myself this beautiful tomb in amongst all the kings of Judah, because I'm so important. I want to be set in amongst and be buried with the kings. I find that pretty remarkable. You know what's interesting is they've found amongst the tombs of the kings of Judah, they found this lintel, and it's been cut out of rock, and it's inscribed in Hebrew, and it's written to the royal steward, and on this lintel it says, this is the tomb of Shebaniah, the royal steward. There's no silver or gold here, only his bones. So this was put there afterwards because they tended to have grave robbers that would go and rob all of these tombs of wealthy kings with the hope of trying to find gold. So they put the sign here and saying there's no gold and silver here, only bones of dead people. Kind of funny, really. It's a little bit like a big flash house and a big sign out the front saying, oh, we've got nothing valuable in here. I don't know how, such a sign would have deterred robbers, but that's what they would do. And then they add this, cursed be the man who opens this tomb. So they would play upon people's superstition. If you go in here, there's dead man's bones and you'll be cursed. But the interesting part is that this is found amongst the kings of Judah, and it's a unique thing in that it's not a tomb to a king. It's a tomb that is inscribed to a steward of a king, whose name is Shebaniah. Now, this is exactly what Isaiah is talking about. Here was this guy who had made himself a tomb amongst the kings. Then Isaiah goes on to say of Shebaniah, he says, there you will die, and there the chariots of your glory shall be the shame of your Lord's house. So when you see that phrase, which, by the way, is picked up later on when we, even Rav Shaker uses it when he stands against the walls of Jerusalem. He says, don't put your trust in Egypt for chariots or for horsemen. And as I said in Isaiah chapter 31, it says, woe to them that go down to Egypt, that trust in horses and chariots. So you get this picture here of who was making these plans or who was buying horses and chariots. Isaiah directly says this of Shebna. There you will die, and there shall the chariots of your glory be the shame or the disgrace of your house. So there's a little chariot running across there. Now, there's the, I suppose, the circumstantial evidence that we can build to show what was taking place in Israel. But you know, there's even more evidence which almost takes this from being hypothesis to being fact, and that is the story of the Hezekiah bulla, the story of the key to the house of David. And it all relies in the discovery of, when we say bulla, we're not talking about a Fijian greeting, bulla. These were seals made of clay, and they had imprints in the seals. Now, this seal, or these seals that they found, were found in a very interesting location. So in the land of Judah, which is going to play a major role in the story of Hezekiah, which we're going to look at in our next few studies, there were three major strongholds: Libnah, Lachish, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem to the south, to the north, Lachish to the south. Lachish they were probably the key areas, they were the key fortresses, the key cities, and Libnah to the east. So they were the key fortresses for any invading country, because obviously if Philistia invaded, Libnah was there as a stronghold. If any southern invader came up, Lachish was there as a stronghold, and Jerusalem was the fortress against any northern invader. Now, we discover that when it says in 2 Kings 18, Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offended you. So this story about Hezekiah and Sennacherib revolves around Jerusalem and Lachish. So Hezekiah sent from Jerusalem, and there's a picture of Tel Lachish, a picture image of what they believe Lachish was like as a fortified city. And what it was Sennacherib had besieged Lachish. His armies had come around and they besieged Lachish, and they were there. Hezekiah sent to Sennacherib to Lachish. So we know where Sennacherib was, and we know where Hezekiah sent, to Lachish. And he says, I have offended, what do I owe you? How much money? And Sennacherib put upon Hezekiah the fee that he had to pay. So what happens is, about 50 years ago, in around 1966, 1967, which is very interesting time when you think about Jerusalem. So in between 1966 and 1968, they began excavating a site at Lachish. And they found all of these interesting fragments or bullas. They found 17 lumps of clay with clay impressions which bore Hebrew inscriptions upon them. And amongst those, they found these different seals. So that was really interesting 50 years ago. And then only, what are we now? Only 13 years ago, which is remarkable, in 2007, they found again at the very same site this bulla stamp, and it's quite unique. And it's found in the same areas, but when they examined it and they examined the inscriptions on it, this bulla, this seal, has this on it. It has belonging to Shebaniah, the servant of the king. Now, this is remarkable because here you've got a seal which is given by Shebaniah. So he has the authority of the king to pay on behalf or to make decisions on behalf of King Hezekiah. It's his seal, and he does this on behalf of the king. And I think what we're being told here is that these decisions about paying Sennacherib, about going to Egypt, about making a confederacy with the king of the south, were all done under the patronage of Hezekiah, king of Judah, because he was still king. But he was not calling the shots. He was incapable of calling the shots. And it was all happening because of this wicked servant, Shebna. And so what we find in the story of Isaiah, of course, is that Shebna is ultimately demoted and Eliakim is given title over Shebna. When we come to the final conflict, we'll find that Eliakim is over the house. He is the man in charge when Rabshakeh comes into the land. So when you see the picture in Isaiah chapter 36, verse 3, and this is a picture of Rabshakeh coming there, he meets, it says, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who is over the house. So here you see, by the time Rabshakeh invades, Shebna's been demoted. He's been booted out of his position, and Eliakim is chief man in charge. So this is really interesting, isn't it? You get all of this, you know, top secret stuff that's going on. This is spy versus spy, and I love this history of Hezekiah's story, that you get the intrigue of the conspiracy, the corruption, the secret plans that are going on, the secret negotiations, the deals that are being done with Egypt, and all the while, you know, it's all being led by this story of Shebna. Now, there's something interesting in Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 25, these are Proverbs which were compiled, it says, by Hezekiah. So it's and there's a section in Proverbs which are Proverbs for kings. And there's some really interesting stories or connections in these Proverbs. It says, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah copied out. And so the construction of these Proverbs is really interesting. Now think about these in connection with Shebna. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it's better to be told, come up here, than to be put in the lower presence of a noble. Trusting in a treacherous man in a time of trouble is like a bad tooth or a foot that slips. And a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. Now, isn't that interesting when you think about how, you know, Shebna in that story? And I'm sure when Hezekiah got his men to compile these Proverbs, he had Shebna in mind. In contrast, there was Eliakim, who we find was a very faithful servant. Like cold of snow in time of harvest, is a faithful messenger to those who send him. He refreshes the soul of his master. With patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. When a land transgresses, it has many rulers, but with a man of understanding and knowledge, its stability will long continue. One's pride will bring him low, but he who is lowly in spirit will obtain honor. And that is truly the story of Eliakim. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And in Revelation it says, these things saith he that has the keys to the house of David. And he quotes, Jesus quotes Isaiah 22 in Revelation chapter 3. These things says he that has the key to the house of David. To him that openeth, and no man shutteth, I will make him a pillar in the house, or in the temple, in the house of God. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of God. A little quote there, John 14 verse 2, in my Father's house are many mansions, I go to prepare a place for you. Interesting. It says of Eliakim in Isaiah chapter 22 verse 23, he shall open and no man shall shut, he shall shut and no man shall open, he has the keys to the house, and I will fasten him like a peg in a sure place. Eliakim's name means Yah will establish. He will fix him and establish him like a peg in a sure place. Contrast that to Shebna in verse 18 of Isaiah chapter 22, or verse 17 of Shebna. Behold, the Lord will hurl you away violently, you strong man. He will seize hold of you and will whirl you around and round and throw and toss you like a ball. And I get this picture of a tumbleweed. There's this contrast of Shebna, who's just been tossed and blown, and there's no stability in Shebna. Whereas Eliakim is a picture of a peg, boom, which is in a sure place, a peg that you can hang on and that you can fasten to and you can trust. And it's the picture of two servants. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom the Lord shall make ruler over his house? And you get this picture in Matthew chapter 25 of the story of faithful servants, loyal servants, and wicked servants. And the story is based on the story of Shebna and Eliakim. Well, that's a little bit of our intrigue of what was happening building up to the second wave, the invasion of Assyria. What we're going to focus on when we come and look next week is we're going to look at the third aspect of trust, the last aspect of trust, authenticity, genuineness. And we're going to see this in the story of Hezekiah getting well. And we're going to consider Hezekiah the vaccine. Thank you.